There is a moment that almost no one speaks about, a moment that does not appear dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no revenge, no visible collapse. Yet psychologically, it is an earthquake. Carl Jung identified something that deeply unsettles narcissistic personalities, not because it makes the empath cruel, but because it makes them unreachable. And narcissists cannot survive what they cannot reach. This moment occurs when the empath is no longer wounded, but finished, not bitter, not hardened, not seeking revenge, just done. Jung described this as an alchemical turning point, a psychic reaction where poison is not expelled, but absorbed, processed, and transformed into something entirely different. He referred to this process as psychological alchemy. And once it happens, the empath does not become dangerous in the way the world assumes. They become unbreakable. Most people misunderstand empaths. They assume empathy is weakness. They believe sensitivity means fragility. They think kindness is naivety. But Jung perceived something very different. He believed empaths possess what he called authentic being, a psyche rooted in lived experience rather than appearance. Narcissists, on the other hand, do not live from being. They live from persona, masks, reflections, borrowed energy, and external validation. Where the empath feels deeply, the narcissist performs deeply. And this difference changes everything once the empath reaches their breaking point. A narcissist feeds on reaction, admiration, fear, confusion, emotional chaos. This is what Jung would later conceptualize as a form of psychological vampirism, not evil in a theatrical sense, but unconscious. The narcissist does not drain because they enjoy cruelty. They drain because they are empty. The empath, meanwhile, has always been full but leaking. Leaking energy, leaking forgiveness, leaking understanding, leaking chances until one day they simply stop. And that is when the balance of power reverses. Jung warned that the most dangerous psychological transformation is not rage, it is integration. Because when the empath integrates what they were taught to suppress, anger, boundaries, discernment, self-authority, they do not swing into cruelty, they move into clarity. This is where Jung introduced the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when pushed to an extreme. Excessive empathy eventually becomes sovereignty. Endless giving becomes self-possession. Silence becomes presence, and presence is frightening to those who rely on manipulation. Here is the part narcissists never expect. The empath does not fight back. They withdraw psychic access. No more explaining, no more defending, no more proving reality. Just an internal shift. And suddenly manipulation has nowhere to land. Jung believed this moment marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not good, not moral, not socially acceptable, whole. And wholeness does not negotiate with dysfunction. This is why a fed-up empath is not loud. They are calm. They do not expose the narcissist. They do not seek justice. They do not require closure. They simply stop participating in the illusion. And illusion is the narcissist's oxygen. Jung once wrote that the greatest burden a human can carry is an unlived life. The empath has lived too much for others. The narcissist has lived too little within themselves. When the empath stops offering their inner world as shelter, the narcissist is forced to face their own emptiness, and that confrontation is unbearable. This is the alchemical moment, the moment when suffering becomes insight, when pain becomes structure, when empathy becomes power. Not power over others, but power within. From this moment forward, the empath begins to rise through distinct psychological stages. Stages Jung outlined long before modern psychology gave them clear names. Stages that end with something rare. An empath who cannot be manipulated. An empath who sees through masks almost instantly. An empath who no longer confuses love with self-erasure. In the next part, we explore the 3 levels of empathic development, from unconscious empathy to wounded awareness to what Jung would call the sovereign psyche. We will also begin examining why narcissists panic when they sense this shift, even before the empath says a single word. Part 2, the 3 stages of the empath's awakening. Carl Jung never used the modern term empath the way it is used today, but he certainly described them. He spoke of a certain psychological type, deeply attuned to the emotional atmosphere, highly responsive to the inner states of others, instinctively oriented toward meaning rather than dominance. What Jung observed was that these individuals do not remain the same throughout life. They evolve, and that evolution follows three distinct stages. Most people never move beyond the first. Many suffer endlessly in the second. Very few reach the third, and narcissists fear the third more than exposure. Stage 1, the unconscious empath. This is where empathy begins. The unconscious empath feels everything but understands almost nothing about why. They absorb moods. They internalize blame. They feel responsible for the pain of others. They mistake emotional intensity for intimacy. They mistake trauma bonding for love. They mistake self-sacrifice for virtue. At this stage, empathy is porous. There are no boundaries because boundaries feel cruel. The unconscious empath believes if I just love harder, explain more clearly, forgive deeper, they will change. Jung would say this empath is identified with the shadow of others. They carry what others refuse to face, and narcissists instinctively recognize this not consciously but instinctively, like a predator sensing an exposed nervous system. This is why narcissists are drawn to empaths so quickly. The empath mirrors, the empath listens, the empath validates. But what the empath believes is connection is often projection. The narcissist projects an ideal self. The empath projects hope, and both believe the illusion, though for completely different reasons. But eventually, something cracks, because empathy without selfhood becomes exhaustion, and exhaustion forces awareness, which brings us to the second stage. Stage 2, the wounded awakening empath. This is the most painful phase. This is where the empath realizes, I have been giving life to something that feeds on me. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow, not the narcissist's shadow, the empath's own. Anger they were taught to suppress. Boundaries they were told were selfish. Instincts they were taught to doubt. This is the stage of confusion. They oscillate between compassion and rage, between guilt and clarity, between leaving and staying. They see the manipulation but still feel responsible. They understand the pattern but still hope it will change. This is where narcissists fight the hardest to regain control. Why? Because awareness weakens the spell. At this stage, narcissists escalate. They gaslight more subtly. They play the victim more convincingly. They alternate cruelty and affection. This is not careful strategy. It is panic. Because Jung understood something essential. Once someone becomes conscious of a complex, the complex begins to lose its power. And the narcissistic dynamic is a complex, a psychic loop fueled by unconscious participation. The wounded empath often asks, why does it hurt so much even after I see the truth? Because awareness comes before integration. Seeing the poison is not the same as neutralizing it. This stage is the dark night of empathy, but it is also the gateway. Stage 3, the sovereign empath. This is the stage Jung rarely witnessed but deeply respected. The sovereign empath does not lose empathy. They master it. They no longer merge emotionally. They observe. They no longer over-explain. They speak once, clearly. They no longer seek to be understood. They understand themselves. This empath has integrated their shadow. Anger becomes discernment. Sensitivity becomes perception. Compassion becomes choice. And here is the part narcissists cannot tolerate. The sovereign empath does not react. No emotional supply, no defense, no collapse, just presence. Jung believed individuation culminates in inner authority, not domination, not control, but authority over one's psychic energy. This empath is no longer available for psychological vampirism because they no longer leak identity. They are anchored, and anchored people are immune to manipulation. The narcissist senses this shift instantly, even if nothing is spoken. The empath's energy no longer responds to hooks. No guilt, no urgency, no emotional chase. And suddenly the narcissist is left alone with themselves, which is the one place they cannot endure. The rise method and the death of psychological vampirism begins with a realization that Carl Jung emphasized repeatedly. Real transformation does not occur simply by thinking differently. It happens when the psyche reorganizes itself, not through affirmations, not through sheer willpower, but through conscious confrontation with what has long been avoided. This is where the empath's awakening stops being purely emotional and becomes structural, something deeper and far more permanent within the psyche. To understand this process, it helps to consider what Jung would recognize as a four-stage movement of individuation. It can be described as the rise method, not a technique, but a psychological sequence that unfolds once awareness begins to mature. It is not something that can be forced, and once it begins to unfold authentically, it cannot easily be reversed. The psyche begins to rearrange itself around truth rather than illusion. Recognition is the first step, and recognition is brutal. This is the moment the empath stops romanticizing suffering. They begin to recognize patterns rather than isolated incidents. Instead of asking why someone else behaves a certain way, they start asking a more unsettling question: why am I still here participating in this pattern? Jung emphasized that projection dissolves the moment responsibility returns to the self. This is not self-blame, it is self-reclamation. The empath recognizes that their empathy has often been unbounded rather than virtuous. Their loyalty has sometimes been misplaced rather than noble. Their exhaustion becomes information rather than a burden to hide. This recognition quietly dismantles the narcissist's leverage because manipulation depends heavily on confusion and emotional fog. The next movement is integration, and this step is frequently misunderstood. Integration does not mean forgiveness. It does not mean understanding the narcissist more deeply or excusing destructive behavior. Integration means reclaiming the empath's disowned traits, their anger, their refusal, their capacity to walk away without providing endless explanations. Jung warned that what we repress does not vanish. It simply controls us from beneath the surface. The empath who represses anger becomes overly compliant and easily manipulated. The empath who integrates anger becomes discerning. They begin to recognize when something violates their integrity and respond accordingly. This transformation alters how they move through relationships. At this stage, the empath stops being morally predictable, and predictability is precisely what narcissists rely on. When someone always forgives, always explains, always returns, manipulation becomes easy. But once those automatic responses dissolve, the dynamic loses its stability. The narcissist can no longer rely on the same emotional hooks. Something unusual begins to happen during this phase. The empath may feel less emotional on the surface, but far more alive internally. They become less reactive, yet more present. Their responses are no longer driven by suppressed emotions erupting unpredictably. Instead, they operate from a more unified sense of self. They are no longer split between who they feel they must be and who they truly are. They stop outsourcing their shadow to other people. They acknowledge their full emotional range consciously. And a conscious shadow is not destructive, it is protective. It provides boundaries that were previously missing. The third movement is separation. This is often misunderstood as physical distance, but Jung described it more accurately as psychic withdrawal. The empath stops explaining their inner world to someone committed to misunderstanding it. They stop arguing with distorted versions of reality that were designed to keep them trapped in endless debate. They stop chasing accountability from people who cannot provide it. Jung described this shift as withdrawing projections. When projections return to their source, psychic energy returns as well. And when that energy returns, the narcissist experiences something deeply unsettling: irrelevance. Irrelevance is not the same as rejection or abandonment. In many ways, it is worse. Rejection still acknowledges the narcissist's importance in the emotional field. Irrelevance removes that importance entirely. The empath's attention is no longer orbiting around the narcissist's behavior. During this stage, narcissists often attempt to provoke reactions. They may create conflict, guilt, or emotional drama in an effort to re-establish connection. Even negative attention restores the familiar, energetic exchange. But the empath is no longer emotionally available in the same way. They are not closed off or cold. They are complete. The final movement is embodiment. This is where the transformation becomes visible in subtle ways. The empath does not simply think differently, they exist differently. Their nervous system begins to regulate itself. Their posture becomes grounded. Their voice slows and carries less urgency. They no longer rush to fill silence. They do not scramble to justify their experiences. They trust their internal authority. Jung believed that this is the moment when the self, rather than the ego, becomes the organizing center of the psyche. And from that center, manipulation simply fails to register the way it once did. This is where the difference between psychological vampirism and conscious empathy becomes clear. Psychological vampirism feeds on reaction. It requires emotional turbulence to survive. Conscious empathy operates from choice rather than compulsion. Vampirism collapses when the emotional supply disappears. Conscious empathy does not require permission or validation in order to exist. The sovereign empath can feel deeply without granting access to their inner world. They can care without dissolving their identity. They can love without disappearing inside another person's chaos. They can witness pain without absorbing it as their own responsibility. This is precisely why awakened empaths become unsettling to narcissistic personalities, not because they attack, but because they cannot be consumed. Eventually, this leads to what could be called the emergence of the empathic warrior, not someone who fights others, but someone who has integrated their inner contradictions. Carl Jung never believed the ultimate goal of psychological development was simply being good. He believed the deeper goal was wholeness. Goodness without strength collapses under pressure. Strength without empathy becomes destructive. But when empathy and strength integrate within the same psyche, something rare appears. Not a savior, not a victim, and not a fighter in the traditional sense. An empathic warrior. The empathic warrior does not spend their energy battling other people. Instead, they confront inner fragmentation. They do not feel the need to expose narcissists publicly. They allow narcissists to reveal themselves naturally through irrelevance and lack of emotional engagement. Jung understood that once the self becomes the organizing center of the psyche, external chaos loses its authority. The empathic warrior does not need to dominate conversations. They do not need to win arguments. They do not need constant validation from others. Their reality is internally confirmed. Because of this, narcissists eventually drift away from awakened empaths, not because they are defeated in some dramatic sense, but because there is nothing left to extract. No admiration, no guilt, no emotional turbulence. What remains is calm, grounded presence, and presence cannot be manipulated. Jung believed that the persona, the mask people wear socially, is necessary early in life. It helps individuals navigate society. But when the persona becomes the entire identity, it turns into a prison. Narcissists live almost entirely inside that persona. They must perform continuously. They must be seen, admired, validated. Their identity depends on maintaining the illusion of that mask. The empathic warrior no longer depends on being seen. They see, and that calm, steady gaze becomes unbearable for someone who survives on illusion. It reflects reality without participating in the performance. The irony is that the empath never sought power, yet power arrives the moment they stop abandoning themselves. The fed-up empath becomes dangerous in a very specific way. Not dangerous in behavior, but dangerous to dysfunction, dangerous to unhealthy cycles, dangerous to unconscious patterns that relied on endless forgiveness and self-sacrifice. The fed-up empath no longer rescues. They no longer explain abuse away. They no longer spiritualize suffering in order to endure it. Instead, they leave systems that require self-erasure in order to function. And systems like that collapse when empathy exits. Jung once wrote that the most terrifying thing a person can do is accept themselves completely. The fed-up empath eventually does exactly that. They accept their compassion, but also their anger. They accept their generosity, but also their limits. They accept their refusal to be consumed. From that acceptance emerges a quiet authority that cannot be argued with because it is rooted in direct experience rather than borrowed beliefs. The final truth becomes clear through this transformation. Empathy was never meant to be endless giving. It was meant to be perception. The empath's sensitivity was not a flaw or weakness. It was training. Training to see beneath masks. Training to feel subtle emotional shifts. Training to recognize when something is no longer alive or authentic. Once that training completes, the empath does not return to innocence. They return to truth. And truth does not shout. It does not argue endlessly. It does not chase validation or approval. It simply stands.